Hello, everyone, and welcome to day one of Communicate. I hope that you're all well. I hope the technology is working for you, joining this conference in a virtual way. I'm sure many of you have been to Communicate before, and I hope you're enjoying this new virtual way, being able to continue the conference this year. So my name is Chris Dunford. I'm Head of Environmental Sustainability for UK Research and Innovation, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this very timely session today. What I'll do is I'll just quickly talk you through the aims of the session, and I'll introduce the other people we have on the panel. So what we're going to try and do with this session, which is obviously is how to refocus in the age of COVID-19, something I'm sure we've all had to do in one way or another, is we'll recognize that the impact that's had, and we'll do that looking at a particular organization, that organization being Hubbub. And those of you who are Communicate veterans will obviously be familiar with Hubbub. We've heard their story before and always been very impressed by what they've done. So it's perhaps suitable that they are the people, as a case study, talking through what's happened to them since the pandemic began this year. So they'll introduce themselves, they'll talk through what's changed for them, how they've responded, some examples from that. And throughout the session, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and look at how this relates to you. So there'll be various points where we'll pause, we'll hear from you in the form of opening questions or some polls. So we get some information from our audience as well, and try and express it in a way in which you'll hear about what Hubbub has done, but to try and express some kind of takeaways that would be useful for your organization, whatever that is. So I'll very quickly hand over to Hubbub themselves, and I'll kind of interject as we open up polls and questions to yourselves, the audience. So I'm very pleased to hand over to Alex Robertson, who's director at Hubbub, and to Rosie Gordon-Lennox, who's creative lead at Hubbub. Alex and Rosie, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for having us here today. So I'm just going to give you a very, very quick intro to who we are and how we got here before we get into the aims of the session. Hopefully you can all see the slides that we have shared. So Hubbub is a very unusual charity. We are a environmental charity that commits to only doing positive campaigns, and we want to talk to a mainstream audience. We want to talk to people who don't consider themselves green, which means that we have to be very creative, and we focus on having fantastic design, because we know that we're competing for people's attention with commercial campaigns, with everything else that's out there, not just with say other charities. And you might also know us as a behaviour change agency, because we're focused on getting people to take action, not just being aware of things. We just skip to the next slide. It shows you something about what that looks like in reality. So we work on things that people care about already in their daily lives. So we organise our work around food, fashion, homes and neighbourhoods. So just to run through what you can see on the screen to give you an idea, on the left is a bin that blows bubbles called Gordon Binnett in Leeds. That's part of an on-street recycling project in Leeds that was funded by all the companies that create the stuff that we should be recycling instead of throwing away on the street. Second picture, we're giving away a growing at home kit to get people who have limited space, limited garden space, growing for the first time and making kind of micro green spaces. The third is a project with Mothercare where we get great condition second-hand baby clothes in packages and give them to families who would find them difficult to afford. And then the last picture is from our community fridge network. We have 100 fridges around the country as part of a network that they're effectively honesty fridges that give away fresh surplus food to anyone who wants it. So that should give you a kind of taste of who we are and how we work. And have to say that until about February this year, things were going really, really well. We've grown a huge amount in 5 years, from a tiny charity that started with 3 people and just a few £1,000, and a commitment to never being more than 7 people, because if you couldn't all sit around one table, then you couldn't function in a kind of creative and intimate way, through to an organisation with 30-something people and a turnover in the millions. So, and we had a national partnership with Starbucks that was really driving our funding as well. So anyone who took a takeaway cup at Starbucks paid a 5p levy, and that 5p came to us. And it turns out Starbucks sell quite a lot of drinks, or at least they did. And that was transformative for us. So things were really good. And the reason we're here today is we're going to talk about how they stopped being good and what we have done since to try and turn it around, where we've had successes. And what I hope is that you can see from the way that we structured it and some of the ideas we had and risks we took, that there might be things that are useful to you and your organizations as well. So I actually kept a diary at the start of this crisis. So I thought I'd read you a bit of an entry from Tuesday, the 17th of March, where it says, first day working from home, funding and projects collapsing as I try to revise the financial forecast. Our CEO is trying to bring in money. The other directors are keeping what we have in play. Incredibly stressful. And then there's a comment about my wife buying a trampoline. So, which was very useful for the for the children in the garden. So, we had to stop nearly all of our projects because so many of them were took place in real life. Our work is getting people involved in environmental campaigns, whether that's on street recycling in Dublin, you can see there on the left, through to people reclaiming and reviving the alleyways behind their houses, or cutting down plastic pollution in the rivers. We weren't able to deliver any of it, and worse, we lost all of the projects that we were in negotiations for. So we lost more than half of our income, more or less overnight. And we went from what looked like a kind of break-even-ish situation for a charity, which is normal, to an absolutely mighty loss. And of course, on top of that, you had all the challenges of suddenly everyone being working from home. So operationally, it was very difficult. So, however, today, 6, 7, 8 months later, I'm losing track, we have more or less turned it around. I'm not saying that we don't still have a lot of challenges, but we have managed to find new projects, new ways of working, new relationships, new ways of using our skills that have helped us to both have the impact that we're trying to make and to generate funding from places where we hadn't generated it from before. So I won't say that the future is definitely looking wonderful, but it's looking unrecognizable from what it looked like back in April. So, and in fact, we're even hiring at the moment, which tells you that it can't be going too badly. So we're going to talk a bit about how that has happened today.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. So before we talk about what's happened to, if you like, address that problem, looking back on the kind of the COVID-19 situation hitting your organization, I'm sure that's going to resonate with everyone on the call in some way. So you'll notice we put a question in the chat, in the session chat, which reads, what from what we just talked about so far resonates with you the most? So we'd love to hear your answers to that. Please type those into the session chat. And the nice thing is we can all see each other's answers. I suppose, although we probably miss being in the room together, one of the advantages of using this technology is if we're in the room and I said, all shout out your answers simultaneously, that wouldn't really work. The nice thing about the chat is we can pose a question like this, you will have a chance to answer, and then we can all read each other's answers. Whilst people are pausing to do that, I did have one question for yourself, Alex, which is, and this is based upon my experience of talking to other organizations. Most organizations have risk registers. They have contingency plans for the unexpected things might happen. the pandemic very much came out of the blue for most people and caught them by surprise. Did you have any plans? Did you have any risk registers that allowed for this, or was it completely out of scope for what you prepared for previously?
It's a good question. So I actually took on this role in the charity on the 1st of March. So just 2 weeks before this happened, although I was working in the organisation already. And risk became part of my remit. So I did go back and look at what we had. And it wasn't in any way fit for purpose for a pandemic. And I don't say that as a criticism to my predecessor. Just we were focused on risks around our projects themselves, the funding streams, and some of the culture of the organisation. So we redid the risk register pretty quickly, but I mean it was built from scratch. I think we were really, in the dark, and I guess like everyone else, not only were we in the dark, but so was everyone else around us because they hadn't been through it either.
Yeah, I think going forward, I imagine people will have pandemics on their risk registers. But the question is, have they learned from this to prepare for the other unexpected things coming down the line? And of course, things like climate change remind us that there will be other changes that we haven't yet prepared for. Looking at the responses in the chat, you're all, as a group, fairly optimistic. So people, yes, they've admitted there were stressful and difficult times, but you've mostly focused on the positives of learning to adapt and the new skills you've all used, and some comments there about kind of refocusing on the communities you want to be working with. So that's a very positive way of viewing it. So that very much poses the situation, the crisis as it hit. So I'll hand back to you to tell us how you then adapted to that.
Sure. So of course, a lot of the initial response, certainly the first couple of weeks, was kind of operational and internal, like internal culture, ways of working, and I think that's kind of out of scope for this session, although maybe we can get to it with questions if we have time. So we've grouped what we did into these three areas, which looks very neat maybe in retrospect. It wasn't necessarily planned exactly like this at the time, but the first thing that we felt we really needed to do was to get a better handle on what the new landscape was, what it meant for the environmental sector, what it meant for the topics that we're interested in particular. The second was that we knew we needed to be outward looking, that we wouldn't solve this all with conversations ourselves, and we needed to be talking to all the other organisations around us. And the third, and this is where the way we work at Hubbub I think is really important, is to experiment, to try things out. We did not pivot and commit to something major. We took what we learned, and then we saw what might work, and then we followed it. So I'm going to hand over to Rosie to talk a little bit about the discovery side of things.
Alex. So I'm Rosie and I run the communications at Hubbub, so I'm creative lead. And yeah, so the first stage, as Alex has said, was around discovery. And when COVID struck, we wanted to find out how the world had changed for people, what COVID-19 meant for the environment and for the topics we cover, and also what it meant for the strategic direction of the organisation as a whole. So we worked with Censuswide, which is an insight company, from April through to May, and we ran some polling to find out how COVID had affected the way people eat, shop, travel, and live generally, and what was most important to people right now in that moment, and what they cared about in the future as well on post-COVID. So it confirmed some of the suspicions we had already, whilst also revealing a few surprises. Unsurprisingly, we saw very polarizing results. So the polling revealed that half the population were concerned with how they were going to get food on the table and had been seriously impacted financially, whilst the other half were cooking more, liking the better air quality, walking more, and enjoying blending home and work life in new ways. What we found surprising, though, was that despite the mass panic buying and stockpiling, which we thought would have led to a massive increase in food waste, the polling revealed that actually half of the people that we spoke to were actually throwing away less and valuing their food more. So this particular story was actually one that we pitched to the media, and we got a lot of coverage on the back of it. So in terms of how we use this polling and the value of it, there were kind of three main benefits. So PR being one. In normal times, we would have gained lots of PR coverage from the projects and campaigns we were doing, but obviously with all of them drying up, there was a bit of a gap to fill. So the polling provided a really nice hook for media stories. And I guess for us, the value of gaining coverage is that it often sparks conversations with businesses. So a lot of businesses have got in touch with us in the past through seeing the coverage that we're getting on certain projects. And actually the food waste story we ran led to a collaboration with Tesco. They got in touch having seen these insights in The Guardian, and they said that they were also saying the same thing and that they'd like to talk to us. And we then ran a food waste project on the back of it. So we didn't foresee that, but it was, yeah, a real value of the PR coverage that we got. Secondly, the polling and insights we collected helped to give us more strategic direction as an organisation. So it helped confirm and help guide where we should be focusing our attention and resource based on what the public were valuing. For example, it revealed and confirmed that people's appreciation for having access to green spaces during this time. And now urban greening is a big focus for us for next year and our projects that we're running. It was interesting also, the polling revealed that generally people were valuing stuff more and more considerate of the things they were going to buy. So there was a huge drop in clothes purchasing as a result. And considering this, we've actually slightly relooked at all of our fashion work and held the work for the moment, as it's just not a priority. And we also used the polling to support some of the policy work we did later on in the year, which we'll discuss in a moment. But it was helpful to show the public's support and demand for the asks that we had put together. And finally, there was value in sharing these insights with businesses as well. And it was helpful sharing at talks like this and provided a great base for discussion with other businesses as well, which I think Alex will touch on in a moment.
Thanks, Rosie. So we took all this information from polling and we combined it with our, I guess, curiosity about the world and what our stakeholders might be doing about it, but also just we were trying to figure it out ourselves. So we decided to run these workshops called Hubbub Explores. We took some of these key themes from the polling and set up open questions about them and invited a range of businesses, councils, other non-profits, all kinds of people to join us. And we had these like 2-hour-long discussions, which were surprisingly, I think to us, surprisingly popular. And there were questions like, will COVID-19 change the way we shop? Perhaps most relevant to this group, how does this all change how we communicate environmental issues? And what we found was there were loads of other people who were like us, just really wanted a confidential space with their peers to talk about some of these issues. And I think that we did it by facilitating a discussion, not by trying to host things where we talked at people for the whole session. I realise I'm talking at people now, but and just bringing a diverse group of people together who wouldn't necessarily work with one another to discuss these issues like the future of the high street, as we were really just beginning to think about them. And I think one of the key points that might be worth taking away is that when we did this, we didn't know what we were doing. Like, we had not run any online events before. We had no plans to do so. We had no particular expertise in it. We just knew it was the best idea we had at that moment, and we had to do something. And by doing it, we not only generated new insights, new conversations that have influenced our projects, but we developed expertise doing something that has become incredibly useful, which is hosting and running these online sessions.
Thank you, Alex. So as always, we're keen to hear from yourselves, the audience, and your experiences. So what we'll do is we're going to put a quick poll up now. Hubbub obviously has spoken about the fact that a lot of the projects they're working on pre-pandemic had to come to an end or change, and they had to find alternatives and solutions to that. So we're going to put up a poll, which you should see in the polls section, where we're just asking you to get an idea of the projects that you were running before the pandemic hit in the UK. Which ones, how much have you stopped? In other words, as a percentage, were you able to continue all your projects in one way or another, or have all of your projects come to an end at that point, or something in between? We'd love to see the answers to that. And whilst people are doing that, just had a quick question again for Rosie and Alex, which is, you mentioned changing your approach as an organisation. I was just wondering, kind of individually within your team, did you have team members who perhaps had to change their skill set or change their role working as a team? Were you having to kind of work in different areas personally?
Yeah, so I guess with the whole switch to digital with our wider communications, it suddenly meant that all of the team were becoming content creators and digital experts, and we used a lot of the team for their expertise. So for example, Aoife, our head of food, we asked to do a lot of cook-alongs and live sessions. So she suddenly had to get her head around Facebook Live and more technical social platforms, as well as also, I mean, before we ran lots of brainstorms in the office in a huge space with a whiteboard, and suddenly having to upskill in all these new tech platforms as well was another real learning for the whole team. But I'd say we're getting pretty savvy at that now.
I think there's probably plenty of organisations that had an online engagement team, and then suddenly they find the whole organisation has become the online engagement.
Literally.
Matt, if we could just close the poll there and maybe see the results to see what people have answered on that. And again, this was a question of how many of your projects have kind of come to an end whilst as a result of this. And what we can see there is, okay, so we're looking, it's looking around the kind of, well, it's definitely true that as an average across the group, more than half of us have found that projects have ended. And it looks as though we're mostly around the 50 and 25%. So a significant impact on all the organisations on the call. Rosie, I'll hand back to you to talk more about that digital presence online.
Sure. So yeah, as Alex has said, everything we did before was totally on the ground and in real life. We raised awareness through activities such as installations and running a lot of community projects and this in real life activity is what led our digital and social communications. So when COVID struck, this all slightly flipped on its head, and our digital became the focus and the activity in itself. So in terms of what we did, firstly, we launched a wider comms campaign called Live Savvy. And I guess this came about because we've had so many projects over the years and created so much content for those projects, and had lots of tips on greener living and how-to guides, and covered everything from growing to fashion to homes and food. And all this content was just sort of sitting on the website. So guided by the polling that we did and also Google Trends, we dug into this content and reframed it to make it as useful and relevant for people considering the situation. So we focused on everything from giving people tips on how they can save money and make more of what they have, recipes for making use of your leftovers, how to cut your energy bills, grow your own veg, bake your own bread, and support your local community. So we framed all of this variety of content within the wider theme of Live Savvy. And as I touched on just earlier, we made full use of the team. So whilst we recycled a lot of existing content within this wider Live Savvy theme, we also had a lot of the team whose projects have been cancelled and were therefore willing to help create new content as part of this wider theme. And we were as lean as possible in using the skills and expertise to run live sessions, to share knowledge and write blogs and everything, like Aoife, who got called up many times. And yeah, we ourselves had to upskill definitely in terms of video editing and Google and social ads. We definitely had to watch a lot of YouTube tutorials on this. And thirdly, we shared this content with businesses. So we basically packaged up all of the content that we created in the first month or so and shared this as a pack with other businesses for them to use and share themselves. And on the back of this, we actually had a couple of collaboration requests that came out of sending out this pack. So some brands approached us and asked us to create bespoke content for them. And actually inspired by this, someone in the team saw how we could repurpose this content altogether into effectively a new product, which was a Live Savvy Championship that was an employee engagement program. And she actually ended up pitching it to KPMG and running it with their team, which was amazing because we got so much user-generated content from all the people that took part, and we could then use that in our own comms to inspire more people to take action. But it's worth saying that this new stream of income through creating content for businesses wasn't our intention at all, but shows how actually having the time and flexibility to be able to think about these things, allowed for more exciting collaborations.
Thank you. So I think, Matt, if we can put the next question into the chat, one thing we're curious to know about from yourselves as the audience is also what surprise new things have you ended up doing, and what things is your organization now doing which you weren't doing before? Now, obviously, I'm guessing a lot of this will probably be in the online space because, of course, we couldn't do things in person. But if there are any things that your organization is doing now that you weren't doing before the pandemic, if you're happy to share those in the chat, it'd be interesting to see what themes start popping up there. And then for time, what I'll probably do is hand straight back to you, Alex, to take us into the next bit.
Sure. Ooh, there we go. So we're going to talk about adapting a little bit, because as well as testing, you've got to figure out what you're going to do with the programs that you are running that haven't quite stopped. And I was going to take this as an example. So Food Connect is a new project that we had started to run that was a kind of bolt-on to our community fridge network, where we realized that there's a huge amount of great quality surplus food, and there's a last mile problem. It's really hard to get that surplus food to the places that need it. So we set up in Milton Keynes towards the tail end of last year and starting in this year, a project where we collected and delivered healthy surplus food from shops mainly and restaurants to our community fridges using low carbon vehicles, an electric van, and you can see an electric cargo bike. And this was a project that was funded with a loan, so it was quite expensive to run. And it was totally experimental. So we didn't know that there was definitely going to be a business model at the end of it. We just knew it would be really useful. So then we hit a problem in March where the fridges closed. They couldn't operate as Honesty fridges in the same ways. Lots of the volunteers were elderly and had to isolate. But more people needed food than ever before. And food poverty has become one of the big topics in this year and over the summer. So suddenly our strategy just ran headfirst into reality, and we faced this quandary about, well, do we pull this project for the time being because we don't have funding to continue it, and we can't deliver it in the way that it's supposed to be delivered, or do we use the infrastructure that we've got to deliver food to people who need it to their homes at this time? And in the end, it wasn't much of a discussion because we realized we had to do the latter. And so we flipped it into a delivery service, collecting food from FareShare and helping them to deliver it to people's houses, to isolated people. And that's a cost that we took on. And through doing that, which was surely the right thing to do, what we've also done, of course, is to strengthen our relationships in Milton Keynes. That's Helen on the right of that photo, who's our manager in Milton Keynes. Find the best, most inspiring, dedicated volunteers who have now become part of our paid workforce in the area. Build relationships with the stores, with FareShare, who we hadn't anticipated working with at all. and created a much broader and potentially more interesting project. Now we've started to kind of re-pivot and adapt back to our original intention. So I think it's an example of adapting because you have to, committing to it, and then trying to pull the benefits from it afterwards. And we are now collecting, I think, four tons of food a week from stores in Milton Keynes. I just don't think we were nowhere near that before the crisis. So I think that's a good example of how that has worked out well. But we've also expanded our remit and started working in areas that we haven't worked in before, which I think Rosie will tell you about.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so as Alex has touched on already, COVID has made us really think about the work we're doing and our role as an organisation as a whole. And I think now more than ever, we feel we have a role as an environmental charity to run projects like Food Connect that not only benefit the environment, but have to tackle social issues and help low-income households too. So community calling is another example of this desire to sort of blur the boundaries between social and environmental work and be more reactive to the current issues. So it's a campaign that we launched in May in partnership with O2 in direct response to COVID to tackle the issue of digital exclusion, which has obviously been massively exacerbated by the pandemic. I think there are 11 million people that are currently digitally excluded in the UK. And this means that they don't have access to phone or internet, which is pretty shocking normal times, but let alone in these times where so many of us are relying on phones and the internet to cope and to stay connected as well. So yeah, we launched community calling with the aim of redistributing old smartphones. I think for every phone that's being used, there are currently 4 being unused. So we wanted to redistribute these unused phones, preload them with data and deliver them to people in need. So whilst this project is primarily tackling a social issue, it does have the environmental benefit of reducing e-waste too. So in terms of how it came about, it was an existing relationship with O2 that we had. We were speaking to them anyway at the beginning of the year on another project. But with the start of COVID, O2 was suddenly getting a lot of requests from people in need asking O2 to donate phones to them. So this felt like a far more pressing conversation we should be having with them than the project we were actually planning. So we reacted to this need and tried something new instead of sticking with the original project that was planned. So in terms of how we ran it and what it means for us, we trialled it first in Southwark, which was one of the hardest hit COVID areas. And this whole project was a real learning for us and quite a challenge as well. A, because it was such a quick turnaround. B, the huge variety of partners that were involved. And C, we were working with vulnerable households in a new community, which we hadn't worked in before. But I guess by partnering with O2, a business that was obviously thriving at the time, we sensed this was a project that probably would have longevity. And the pilot was a challenge, but ultimately a success. So, and where we're at today is we're actually now going to be rolling community calling out across 5 different cities nationwide with the aim of supporting a total of 10,000 digitally excluded households. So it's turned into one of our biggest projects we've ever done. And whilst we have done social projects before, like Alex has touched on, the Community Fridge Network, Love Where You Live in Oldham, this felt like a shift in terms of scale and urgency, and something that we want to continue with and is definitely our longer term ambition, is to do more projects that support vulnerable communities and provide both the social and environmental benefit. And yeah, our wider policy work that I briefly touched on earlier focuses heavily on this, which I think Alex is going to discuss now in more detail.
Before we do that, Alex, just to draw the audience's attention to the fact that we put a new poll up, and that's because Rosie mentioned about some of the partners that you were working with, and the poll here looks at funders, and we're interested to know from the audience, of the funders you're working from, are you being funded by the same people as before? Are you being funded by new people now? you've been funded by both old and new, or has all your funding ceased entirely? So that's what that poll is for. So please answer that. And when you click on the answer, when you click on your answer, you will see the results of the poll. Alex, back to you.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So as well as expanding the type of projects we were running, we also expanded the type of work we were doing, because we have a theory of change at Hubbub, as I'm sure many of your organisations do, and we internally we called it the bananas, because there's the shape 2 bananas each side on our diagram, and on one side, and the area we're most focused, is helping individuals, people, make changes in their lives, and it's how to do that. And on the other side, it's about enabling change to happen, and that's much more to do with infrastructure and to do with policy. And we do some work on infrastructure, and particularly at council levels, and our work on waste and things like that, but we hadn't really engaged with policy before. It's not an area of expertise of ours, but we realised that we had spare capacity. We were in a moment where it felt like everything was up for grabs a little bit, and people were receptive to new ideas. And we thought, well, why don't we try and turn some of our ideas and some of the results of our polling, because we knew what the public wanted, to create policy proposals. So we ended up working with a public affairs agency to help us pull that together, and we created something called a green print, which you can see on the screen, which is it's our version of the Build Back Better manifesto, but it's based on really feasible, practical things that we can change, and asks the government that we think are somewhat feasible. And I think it's too early to say whether it's really worked. We've had lots of conversations with MPs. We've submitted evidence to various government committees. I'm sure a lot of people listening know a lot more about this landscape than I do. But what I think I wanted to draw out is that this is something that we committed to doing because we could in that moment, and because it was something that we had the time to do and to experiment with, and because it fulfilled our aims as an organisation. Even though at the start of the year it wasn't part of our strategy, that didn't matter. What mattered was it might be an alternative way to fulfil our aims as a charity. And along the way, we've learned a huge amount about how change happens in the UK. And you might have to ask me next year if we've had any of the policy wins that we're looking for.
Thank you, Alex. So looking at the previous poll, what was interesting is it seems as though for most people, their existing funders, their previous funders, had stuck with them through the crisis, which is good. Some people had secured new funders, and thankfully nobody on the poll had answered that they know that all their funding had ceased completely. So that's good news, I think, at least for the sample we have as our audience here. What Alex was talking about there in terms of their green print has prompted us to our final polls. We've asked that on the screen there, again, under the polls section, you'll see. And this is about strategy. So we're curious to know, within your own organization, has your strategy changed as a result of this? Has it remained the same, or has it, if you like, temporarily shifted? You've got a temporary strategy during these COVID times with the intent of switching back at the end. And don't forget, if you click on your answer, you'll see the results of the poll. So while people are doing that, I did have a question for both yourself and both Rosie and Alex, which is, of all the changes you've made and all the kind of lessons you've learned, and I'm just curious that if I don't know, everyone had the vaccine tomorrow and the world returned to normal tomorrow, then how much of your new work would you retain, and how much would you go back to the way you were working before?
I think that we would retain most of what we are doing at the moment, if not all. I think that even if you could kind of wave that magic wand and make it go away, as Rosie alluded to earlier, it feels like the barriers have come down between social and environmental in terms of those being areas for change. And that's something that we have started to take much more seriously and to think about in a way that I think we had always kind of incorporated, but it hadn't been always that intentional. So I think this pandemic has prompted us to rethink about what we do and who we are as a charity. And that will inevitably affect nearly everything that we do. And I think maybe Rosie, you could answer in terms of our ways of working. What would we keep and what might we lose?
I think we'd lose the traveling a long way to meet partners all over the country, definitely, and do more Zoom meetings. I think in terms of flexibility, it's actually we've been lucky enough to all work from home and come into the office now and then when it's needed, and I think that will probably definitely continue. And we've got quite savvy at using shared documents to work on things, and actually a lot more collaborative as a result. So I think that sense of collaboration and working with people on certain projects will definitely continue. And I think from a comm side as well, having a kind of a core theme or wider campaign like Live Savvy, I think we will continue to do next year as well, and have a wider theme that holds all of our campaigns in and also allows us to be more reactive to the current situation and what people are talking about, and provide tips and relevant inspiration to meet people where they are. So where previously we were very campaign led, I think that more like holistic communications approach is something we'll definitely keep as well.
Thank you. Looking at the results of the poll, what's interesting is only 27% of the audience who've answered said that their strategy has remained the same. So that means the majority, a big majority, have seen their strategy change in some way. And so hopefully the things you've been talking about have rung true. For the last 5 minutes, what we'll say is we'll just open it to questions from the audience. So if you have a question you'd like to ask Alex and Rosie, then please put your question in the chat. Whilst we're waiting for those to come in, I had one other question actually from myself, which is I know that most organizations who work in this kind of public space, public engagement, working communities, felt, if you like, two impacts this year that they responded to. The first one obviously was the pandemic itself, and then some months later the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of organizations responded to as well. Was that something that also impacted your work and that you then had to respond to whilst all this was going on simultaneously?
Yes, of course. And I think, I mean, it's part of this reckoning with the social and environmental spheres coming together. So I think it massively accelerated that trend, and clearly it led to a lot of conversations at Hubbub. And so yes, we addressed it internally, and I mean, I can talk about some of the ways that we did that, but I think what we did in terms of our external focus is we made really sure that we were thinking about the projects that we're running and where we were investing our own surplus through that lens. Because we work with communities all around the UK, and we realised we had to be intentional about the diversity of those communities, which to a large extent was already the case. We worked in Oldham, for example, with our Love Where You Live project, and so we committed that the next project we were going to fund with our free reserves, we would do with the BAME community, and we're working in Tower Hamlets with another charity called Cycle Sisters on an air pollution-based project where we're helping Muslim women in particular start cycling, because it's one of the groups that cycle least and have the most barriers to getting started. So we've done a lot of the internal reckoning that a lot of organisations have done, but I think what we've maybe done differently is we've really looked at also where we're putting our money.
Great, thank you, Alex. I'm aware that we're closing for time, so what I'll do is I'll just pick one question very quickly from the chat, which is, hopefully, Alex and Rosie, I'll use this question to also allow you to sum up, looking at the time, which is, do you think it's worth taking risks when opportunities arise? And obviously you can see a crisis also as an opportunity. So I'll let you both respond to that and use that as your closing remarks in the last minute. Sure. So, I mean, the answer
is going to be yes, but it's going to depend on the risk. But I think that we have seen that you have to place small bets. You know, maybe you're in a position where you have to take a huge risk. But what we've seen is in a time of crisis, we'll try lots of things, knowing they won't all work. And then you pick the winners and you back those. And that feels like, if you can, the best way to manage that risk.
Thank you, Alex. So I think we pretty much run out of time. If you posted a question in the chat and we haven't got around to it, then I'm confident that Alex and Rosie will stay on the chat for a bit longer. And so hopefully, if you have asked a question that hasn't been answered, we will get to that. Other than that, we've reached the end of the time. So the Natural History Consortium, Matt, I can see you about to play the video, the applause video, which tells us we've reached the end of our session. Don't forget, you are very welcome to clap along at home to create that virtual experience in your own home. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you especially for sharing your experiences. It's been very interesting to see your experiences alongside what's happened with Hubbub, and of course, most of all, thank you to Alex and Rosie for sharing their experiences and the work they've done. And maybe you can come back next year to tell us how you've transitioned from the pandemic to whatever comes next. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.